Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Hop Science. I'm Shauna. I'm the speaker coordinator with Women's International Beer Summit, and I'm going to pass this off to Monica and Emily. And feel free to ask any questions. There's the Ask a Question tab there at the bottom, and just keep chatting away. We love this. Anyways, take it away, Monica.
Thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I just have a couple quick reminders for you. If you have any questions for Emily today, we have the Ask a Question box there on the bottom. You definitely can chat to the side there, but to make sure you get your question answered, I would definitely use that Ask a Question box. If you have any tech issues, try to refresh your screen. That usually helps. There is also a little gear at the bottom of your screen where you can lower the resolution if you're having any issues there. Also like to remind you that there's some great scholarships and giveaways on the scholarship page. So go visit that. I'll add that link in a little bit. And of course, this will be recorded. So if you miss any part of it or want to go back and review, you can come back to it later today. All right, let's go ahead and switch it over to Emily so she can get started with Hop Science.
Hello. Thank you so much, Monica. I appreciate it. All right, so before I get too far in here, I'm going to go that transition and get my screen shared because I'm kind of more of an academic background and I prepared a PowerPoint slide for today. All right. So we are going to be talking today, or I'm going to be talking today about hop science primarily through the lens of sensory perception. So I'm going to just dive right on in. I got a call from Melissa McCann, and I was telling Monica earlier, I said, you know, I've never heard of you before. Like, I'm not really sure what, like, is this real? So I've been really excited to kind of get to know her and get to talk with her about what her ideas behind this conference are. And one of the things she mentioned is she really wanted me to talk about how I got to where I am and kind of make this a motivational talk. So that's a new thing for me. I just mentioned I'm an academic background and we don't typically talk about ourselves. So I'm going to do a little bit of that before I dive into more of the kind of science aspects of sensory, some sensory methods that we use to evaluate hops, a brief bit about hop components, and then we're going to smell. Those of you who received the sample boxes, we're going to do some interactive smelling of the hops. So I began my beer career at Oregon State University, and I kind of am starting here because that was my first exposure to the craft beer scene and really to beer in general. When I was a child, my parents didn't drink. I grew up in Oregon in a little town called Kaiser, just outside of Salem, the capital. And the only exposure to beer I had was the 6-pack of Black Butte Porter from Deschutes that my mom kept in the back of the fridge for whenever my grandfather came to visit. So I'm sure it was way past its goodbye date. And yeah, we just didn't have alcohol in the house, except for, I think, a bottle of creme de menthe that may have sat above the stove for a long, long time. But I wandered around a little bit through education fields. I was in a geology major for a while. I always knew that science was something that appealed to me. And one day when I was sitting on the steps of my environmental engineering building saying, I'm not an environmental engineer. What else is there? I actually grabbed the big registration book that they used to have. I don't think they even print them anymore, but it was like a freaking giant dictionary of course catalog. And I said, what else is there here for me? I found a class called food chemistry. And I said, whoa, what is this? They're talking about bread and they're talking about the chemistry of gluten, and I want to know which degree you take to take that course. So I went over to the food science department, which you can see the sign here. This is my senior photos, food science and technology. And unfortunately, I had to wait 4 more years to take that food chemistry course. But during that time, I was exposed to the fermentation aspect of the program. Now, food science and technology was one sub-degree that they had, and the other one was fermentation science. And I got to know a lot of the people who were doing that. We call this ourselves the foodies and the Fermies. And I got to know a lot of people who were really into home brewing. And through, I'm going to go on to the next slide here, through the Food and Fermentation Science Club, I actually got to brew in the pilot brewing facility. We're on the right photo here is actually us making jam for a project in the pilot plant that also housed the fermentation pilot facility. I actually went to look recently on their website for up-to-date pictures, and it's so much bigger and better looking than it was when I was a student. But through that exposure, I really got a chance to dive into so many different aspects of fermentation. The cheese dairy facility is shown on the left here. And in that middle is a picture of some of the really amazing women that I got to learn and grow with while we were in school. So this participation in this Food and Fermentation Science Club and just the community at Oregon State University was such a life-changing experience for me. And while I was there, I did some internships. So I had no idea what I was going to do once I got done with school. I just knew that I wanted to do something that was hands-on and very interactive. And I'm not someone who really enjoys sitting behind a computer all day long. So I applied for an internship at the Food Innovation Center in Portland. And I spent 6 months there with Sarah Masoni, who's pictured there in the black shirt on the bottom, who you may recognize as she had a New York Times article written about her a couple years ago called The $1 Million Palate. And she is someone who really shaped a lot of the experiences I have then had in my career. She allowed me to come in and do product development work in the kitchen. I did shelf life studies. I still thought at that point that I was going to go on and work in a traditional food laboratory and be kind of this new product development scientist. So this next summer, I then applied for a internship. I wanted to get out of Oregon at that point. I'd spent my whole life in Oregon. I think I was like 25 years old at this point. I was an older than average student, and I wanted to see the rest of the world. So I was placed at an internship at Land O'Lakes in Minnesota, and I actually had to look at a map to find where Minnesota was, because I just knew it was somewhere across the border or across the Rocky Mountains, and I ended up being placed in a sensory program, and I had no idea when I got this job that I was going to be working with the sensory team. And those are the wonderful people that you can see up on the top left there. Mostly women, one man at the time, and I got to work with this sensory group, which was just an amazing group of people and really inspired me to continue my education. I had no plans to go on and get any more degrees after I was done with my bachelor's degree in food science. And I was old enough and I didn't want to be in school anymore, but these ladies really inspired me to spend 2 more years at that point to get another degree. And they also showed me that Minnesota was actually a pretty cool place to be. So I then got into the University of Minnesota. I spent 2 years researching Minnesota wine grapes, which I always think is just so funny that I moved from Oregon, the land of hops and wine, to Minnesota, which no one outside of Minnesota really realizes that we have this thriving local cold hardy grape um, program through the University of Minnesota, and I trained panelists to evaluate off flavors in wine. And this woman here shown on the top left is Nuala Babowski. She was working on her PhD through the same professor that I was at the time, Zeta Vickers. And I loved it. I absolutely felt like sensory finally was the way for me to go. And the way I got to this point was really just jumping at opportunities that were provided, saying yes to everything, and really through the support of these wonderful women that I met through my internships and through my schooling. And so I never thought that I would end up working for a beer company in Minnesota. I have now been here since 2012. Minnesota is my new home. I have a daughter who's now a native Minnesotan, and it's really just been an amazing experience for me to move across the country and be a part of the beer scene. And I got to that part, let's keep moving here, through my latest job at Rahr. I did a couple of other positions after graduation from the University of Minnesota, but I really like to think that those were just stepping stones on the way to finding my true home. Um, my boss here at Rahr is actually Patty Aaron, who got her PhD in hop science at Oregon State. She and I overlapped just briefly, just enough to know each other's names. And I got a call from a recruiter one day saying, "Hey, this woman said that you'd be a good fit for our program." And I said, "What? You want me to come and work with sensory and beer?" Yes, of course. So I jumped at the opportunity. I've been here since June 2019, and the last 2 years have really just been taking my purely academic knowledge of beer and sensory science and food chemistry and applying it to what Rahr does best, which is malt, and through their other divisions, which are BSG and Bevy and all of the other wonderful parts of Rahr. Now we actually are working with tomatoes through Bushel Boy, and applying those to malt and hops and beer and spirits and now tomatoes. So this has been a really amazing experience for me. I have so much that I want to continue to do with Rahr. One of the things Melissa asked us to touch on was like, where do you want to go from here? And I really think that Rahr just has so much potential for me. I really get to, as the sensory scientist, I lead the sensory program. So I get to basically guide this amazing company, which consists of a slightly less than 500 people, but they're spread all over the world, from New Zealand and Australia to Canada and the United States. And I get to guide a lot of the new product development and the quality aspects of what we do here. So it's been a really awesome thing for me to work under Patty Aaron. She is one of the world's experts in hops, and part of me laughs that she's not the one giving the talk here today, but she really has been very empowering to me and has taught me most of what I know about hops. I'm going to move forward. I know I'm moving through this pretty fast, so if you do have any questions, please type those in and I'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So sensory science from an academic perspective is the use of people as instruments to measure a stimuli. And when we talk about a stimuli, in this case, we're talking about the aroma, the taste, the feel, the scent, and the sight of, in this case, hops or beer. And fun fact, that picture on the bottom is Patty from her days at Oregon State. So I like to throw that one in here. When we talk about sensory terms, and I have to admit that even I'm guilty of it, even though I know what all these things, what we're talking about are the taste and the smell and the aroma of, in this case, beer. I'm going to actually show my tea cup as an example. I'm fighting a cold today, so my olfactory senses are not working very well. But when I talk about smelling something and breathing in through my nose, I am referring to what's called orthonasal olfaction. So these little volatile chemical compounds come in through your nose and hit the nerves that are up here in your olfactory bulb. They reach down here, and you can kind of see this exaggerated example in this picture. If I then taste the tea, I am experiencing those same odorants coming up through the back of my throat into the same spot, but comes across differently, and that is called retronasal olfaction. And so a lot of people talk about the taste and the flavor of beer or tea in this example. But what you're talking about in terms of taste is actually the basic tastes that come onto your tongue. One of the things I like to do to really showcase this in a if we were in person session is to hand you all a jelly bean and ask you to plug your nose and take that jelly bean and start to masticate or chew it. And what you're really tasting there would be just sweetness, maybe a little bit of waxy mouthfeel from that wax that they used to coat the jelly bean. And it wouldn't be until you actually release your nose and breathe in, that you would actually get that cherry or strawberry or grape flavor or whatever it is. And so I encourage you, the next time that you actually are going to take a sip of beer, plug your nose and see what comes across. You're going to get bitterness from those hops. You're going to get some sweetness from that malt or whatever residual sugars you have. You're going to feel a trigeminal sensation. There is a nerve that runs through your whole head, your face, that actually has three endings: one that ends about here, one that ends about here, and one that ends about here. That's the trigeminal. And those sensations are responsible for the spiciness that you experience when you eat hot or capsaicin laden food, menthol when you're chewing gum, or have that really, sometimes we even experience this in hops, that like cooling sensation. And carbonation of beer is another one. So you'll actually feel when you take a sip of beer, and you may notice this especially when you have a very cold, highly carbonated soft drink or beer, for example, that when you take a sip of that, those bubbles that pop on your tongue actually provide it's actually a pain sensation, and that can create a very unique effect on your mouth, and thus it actually, those little bursts of bubbles release the flavor compounds that then go up to your nose. And so when we talk about flavor, we're talking about a combination of both the true taste buds in your mouth. And fun fact, taste buds are not just on your tongue. They actually have been found now to exist all the way through your digestive tract. That doesn't mean you can necessarily taste, in our experience, what is in your stomach, but there is some research that shows that your body uses that information for some ethereal thing that I don't really understand. But taste buds exist all throughout your digestive tract. And then the retronasal olfaction. So I could wax on a lot about this, but I'm going to keep moving on. One of the things that I hear from people who say they are not good at sensory is that they just don't know what they're tasting, especially when I start training new panelists. They said, like, I sip beer and it just tastes like beer, and I don't really know how to describe what that is. And that's okay. I think one of the things that I really like to share with people is that aromas and tastes and flavors, I'm just going to call them scents here, are linked to some of the oldest biological or evolutionary systems in our body. And what they do is they actually bypass that word center of our brain, and they go straight to memory and to emotions. And so you've ever smelled, for me, the smell of jasmine in particular is extremely triggering. I grew up in Oregon, but I used to go to California every summer to Modesto to visit my great grandparents. And outside my bedroom window there was a jasmine plant. And so the smell of jasmine to me reminds me of summer in California, and it brings me right back to their house in Modesto. And it is part of the way I use that information is to then think about the emotions and the feelings and the memories. Some people get like a little picture that pops in their head. Some people get an emotion, like it can actually be, triggering tears. And then we take that and we take a step back and we say, okay, I know that this smells like my mom's apple pie, but what I'm actually smelling is cooked apples and cinnamon and a little bit of nutmeg and that buttery smell. And so you're actually kind of trying to use both the emotions and feelings that you have, and then translating that into words. And that experience of translating emotions and feelings into words when you're experiencing something is key to becoming good at sensory. All right, how are we doing on time? Perfect. So to evaluate hops, and I will have to be honest, I grew up in the Willamette Valley, miles, not just a few miles from hop farms. I had never smelled hops in the way that I do now until I started at Rahr. And so there are a number of different evaluations that we can use to evaluate the hops. We have an amazing program through our BSG hops folks in Wapato, Washington. And they send us these little samples. Sometimes I get 11-pound bags, and then I have them left trying to figure out what to do with the rest of it. But we get these samples, and the first thing I do is I open the bag and I smell it. I don't do anything with the pellets other than just smelling the headspace. Another way, I'm going to talk about kind of this from most simple to most complex. Another way that we evaluate this is kind of the hop rub. And when we open these samples at the end of this talk, I'll show you kind of how I was taught how to do the hop rub. There's some mixed feelings about whether or not hop rubs are the most scientifically accurate way to evaluate hops, but anybody who's been out in a hop field knows that when you're out in a hop field, you don't have a blender, you don't have a French press, you just, you've got your hands and your nose, and you got to get your hands green in order to evaluate this. The hop grind is what we typically rely on in the laboratory environment, just because it's a little bit easier to provide samples to people on the same basis. It doesn't get your hands green, and I can prepare samples for 10, 15, 20 people at a time. So I just take the pellets and I put them into a blender. We use a magic bullet in the lab, and I grind it up and put it in these samples cups. I then make sure that they're kept in a dark area so they don't light oxidize, and they have to be evaluated pretty quickly. A hop tea is another way that we evaluate it. This actually involves putting that ground hops into a French press. This is actually a large, I think it's a half-liter French press. We follow the methods provided by ASBC. So if you have a membership to that, that's a good reference for these. But it has essentially, I believe, 50 grams of hops, maybe it's 25 grams of hops into 400 liters of room temperature water, and then that's stirred or spun for 20 minutes, filtered, and then what you get is this kind of dark greenish, grayish, brownish, murky liquid that is extremely bitter. Don't drink hop tea, okay? I've had some panelists sip hop tea and they almost always regret it. So, but we smell that liquid, and that actually can do one of two things. It can actually remove some of those really bright vegetal green kind of notes that we get, and allow us to kind of filter past some of these like I said, the vegetal notes that we get from fresh hops. And it actually can kind of give us a little bit of an idea of what it would smell like in a dry hop environment. The next way we do that is actually through this Randall, which is this system here that looks kind of like, I always call it my little octopus tubes. It's got water filtration. My coworker Bobby built this based on some instructions he found online. You have these water filters. You take a bag of ground hops made of kind of cheesecloth. You put them in there, and that way you do is you force beer through this bag of hop material and then serve it to people. And depending on how long you leave it in there and what the concentration of the hops are, you can really kind of give a mimic of, again, what that dry hopping experience tastes like. And then, of course, the most complex way to evaluate hops is actually in beer. But as we all know, even a pilot scale beer setup takes a lot of resources and time. And sometimes we just really need to evaluate those hops and get it through to the next stage on our new product development. So in terms of sensory procedure, I just always like to, when I train my new panelists, kind of teach them the way that works for me, and then allow them to modify this as needed. So for me, I'm always looking at the beer first, or looking at, in this case, tea, and saying, what does it look like? Was the color? Is it hazy? Does it have particulates in it? In the case of hops, we're not probably looking at the appearance so much, unless for some reason the hops themselves, like if we're using a whole cone hops, they have some brownness on them, or they're kind of different size than we're used to. But in terms of hops appearance, with the exception of, moving into that kind of brown oxidized appearance, it doesn't play as much of a role. But I do appearance first, because otherwise I forget to do it. I always want to smell immediate. My instinct is always just to like stick my nose in it, just because I'm always excited to see what it smells like. But I stop and I'm like, nope, I got to write down the appearance first. I write down notes. Then I take the smell of it. 90% of what you experience in a beer, I'm going to just talk about beer, is going to be the smell. Like I said, retronasal olfaction, it is important, in my opinion, to take a sip of the beer. But you'll often see, in the case of wine, I think wine gets a kind of a bad rap in terms of being snobby tasters, but they do some things right, in the sense that they're actually smelling it, swirling it around. There's a lot of different ways you can release those aroma compounds. You can make sure that you cover it and then kind of burp it a little bit. We use these little, you can use watch glasses or lids for your cups. We just use, honestly, the disposable plastic lids that come with our sample cups, and they fit our tulip glasses very well. So we can use that to kind of burp it. If you are swirling it, you're releasing a lot of those highly volatile compounds, especially in the case of a lager or pilsner, where you might have those sulfur compounds that kind of overwhelm your senses. And then you're able to kind of get past that and see what other compounds you have there. The other thing is that I always make sure that you taste it and that you swallow a little bit. You'll see in some cases, I don't think the beer world has the same issue, but you'll see in like wine tastings where, especially when you're doing a lot of tastings back to back, that you'll spit or expectorate into a cup or a bucket your wine. And I think it's important to at least take a small swallow, because again, those taste buds coat your whole digestive tract. You're actually feeling it differently in the back of your throat than you would be if you're not swallowing it. I like to then do, if I'm doing a beer, for example, to make sure that I'm actually plugging my nose before I taste that first sip. That to me gives me a really good representation of what bitterness and the sweetness and the sourness and those basic tastes are. And then I release my nose and get that initial first retronasal experience. Taste, as we already talked about, can include mouthfeel and carbonation, and then aftertaste. Hops are actually really nice because you're not usually tasting them in a beer. And when you're not, you actually get a shorter turnaround time. Once you put a product in your mouth, such as beer, you are actually increasing the amount of time it takes to reset your palate. When you're doing smelling only, it takes less time for your nose to say, oh yeah, I got that. I remember what that smells like, and kind of move on. So if you ever notice, like, especially ice cream is a really good example, because ice cream is cold. That nothing tastes as good as that first bite. That first bite, you always get like the feeling of the ice cream. Your mouth is kind of warm still, and it melts the product. You get all of those things. If you've ever noticed, by the last bite of the ice cream, unless the ice cream's warmed up enough to like be really soupy, your mouth is kind of frozen. It really has, your mind has basically said, okay, I know what this tastes like, and I'm going to start to like move on from that. So we really need to make sure that, especially when we're evaluating a lot of products in a row, that we give ourselves time between samples. I like to say 5 minutes is a rough estimate, but when you're doing a lot, 5 minutes can feel like a really long time to wait. One other way you can do it is kind of to sniff your arm. Some people use ground coffee. Essentially what it does is it just reminds your nose that there are other smells, and then when you come back to it, then you have a fresh place to start. Other considerations that we have here in the lab are the research question. Always in my world, I get people say, "Okay, Emily, I want to run a sensory test," and I'm like, "Okay, what's the question that you want to answer? Do we want to know which sample do people like more? Do we want to know, does this fit the ideal version of a Northeast IPA, for example? Do we want to know, um, there's so many different questions that we can answer. And I think when we're looking from a brewery standpoint, usually what it is, are there any off flavors? Is this okay to release to the public? Does this match our kind of spec or our idea of what this beer is supposed to taste like? And is it okay to go on to the public? Or in the tap room? So, and then usually it's hard to remove for your own self, but do I like it? We ask liking a lot in our world, and a lot of times it really just doesn't tell us anything because everyone has so many different opinions as to what the ideal beer is. And so that's when we go into a consumer world and we start looking for people like, if I'm releasing an IPA, like, let's get IPA drinkers, because otherwise we're going to have a bunch of people who don't like IPAs and they're going to tell us they don't like it, and then it really doesn't tell us anything. So that kind of falls into the experimental design aspect. And again, I'm talking a lot about this from a research laboratory experience perspective. There are a lot of different ways to implement these things that I'm talking about in a brewery that literally has 4 people working there. I think it's really important to always taste the product before you release it. I worked with a company one time in a previous life that was a subcontractor, and they released an energy drink that was supposed to taste like pineapple, and it tasted like strawberry. And the company people called them and said, "Hey, my strawberry, my pineapple drink doesn't taste right." And that was because they measured the analytics. They measured all of the aspects of the product of the energy drink, except for the taste of it. And I'm always surprised at how many people don't actually taste the product before they release it. So, and get people in your brewery who may be a little bit more discerning. I think it's probably easy for some people to say, "Oh yeah, it tastes good, it's great." But what you may not know is that you are anosmic, or you are unable to smell certain compounds. We have a couple of people in our group who are extremely sensitive to sulfur compounds, for example, and they pick up the sulfur in everything. It smells like boiled eggs or burnt matches. But we also have one person who literally can't smell dirt or geosmin flavor. And so we definitely know that if we're looking for that, we're not going to ask him for that. So learn what you're kind of tuned into, practice these things. One of the best way to go about doing that is to get these sensory kits or reference standards. BSG sells these flavor active kits that have a lot of different off flavors. They're little capsules that you put into beer or water. They make up about a liter of these off flavors, and you can actually take those and train yourself. What does DMS smell like? What does mercaptan smell like? What does butyric smell like? These are all off flavors in the sense that these are not things you typically want in your beer, but they also have ones that are good questions. You're looking for this really grapefruit aroma. I don't typically use flavor standards for those. I go to the grocery store and I'll buy grapefruits and mandarins and tangerines and lemons and limes, and I present these to my panelists and say, this is what citruses smell like. If I want you to be able to describe grapefruit, this is what a grapefruit smells like. So there's all sorts of ways that you can train yourself or train your panelists in order to get these exposure. And I really think that practice and writing down what you experience is the best way to train yourself. And I know that there are many other women who are going to be talking today and tomorrow about BJCP and Cicerone, and I'm really excited to see what else they have to talk about. I'm just really touching on the tip of the iceberg here. Okay, so when we're talking about hops, what we're talking about is a lot of different compounds that go into this really complex matrix that essentially we're really only interested in less than 10% of what goes in here. A lot of the rest of this is just kind of the carrier for it. So the essential oils that bring the aroma and the flavor to these hops is typically between 0.5 and 3.5% essential oils. Beta and alpha acids are obviously important in terms of bittering, but we're going to be talking primarily about aroma today because we're not using these in a beer today. We're just going to smell them. This is our hop oil distillation setup that we have in the lab. And that is what we use to evaluate the essential oils. So we essentially run a cold water steam distillation to separate the oils from the hops. And then we take those oils and put them onto our gas chromatography and tell you on the COA what percentage of different hop oils are in there. And you'll see some, if not all, of these hop oils. Myrcene is probably the most widely recognized as being a very highly important active compound in fresh hop oils. Has this kind of green herbaceous. I always think it smells just like carrot tops. And then all these other ones, you may or may not see these on there, but it's good to kind of get an idea of what these words are and what they contribute. Just because you see them in the hops, however, does not mean you will see them in your beer. So while it may be good to kind of educate yourself a little bit on these more, I'm not going to talk too much more about these just because it's getting long for time. But essentially, if you talk about farnesene or geraniol, humulene, linalool, pinene, and limonene, it's kind of fun to dive into the science of what these compounds are and where they are also found. So I'm going to move on to hop evaluations, and I'm going to see if I can just minimize my screen here. Stop sharing. There we go. Hi, Monica. You don't have hops, do you?
Sorry, I turned my mic off so I could listen and not be distracting. I don't, but that's okay.
I don't think everyone has.
It's raining outside right now, Mama.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I'm honestly surprised mine hasn't wandered upstairs yet either. So we've got about 20 minutes left here, and I'm just going to do a little bit. I'm going to start with Evergreen. Evergreen is one of the newer blends that we released recently through our Hop Solutions program, and I believe they're all now called HS. They've changed them. Oh, good, you've got yours. Awesome. So I have the retro packaging here. So if you have them, what I'd encourage you to do is to open up that package and really just take a sniff. Like, you can kind of smell it from here already. You kind of move it a little bit far away from your nose. You're already getting those like really volatile, fruity, kind of what quintessential hop aromas that you're getting. And then sniff a little bit closer. And what you'll find, I hope you can hear me, what you can find is that you'll actually burn your nose out fairly quickly if you just kind of stick your nose into this. It's a very strong aroma. I'm getting that really carroty, myrcene, grassy kind of component from it. And it almost burns the back of your throat, doesn't it? Yeah. So what we do typically is then, so this is how I learned. We have a new employee on our team, Eric Santarud from Mighty Axe Hops. He's an awesome guy, and he just taught me recently about how he evaluates hop pellets for a hop rub. And so you can pour these into your hands, and they should be fairly soft. You can kind of take your thumb and use it like a mortar and pestle. I always forget which one's which. And you can kind of break it up. Your hop pellets should be fairly soft. They should probably break underneath your thumb fairly easily. Mine are a little harder, or maybe I'm just a little weak. Then again, these are vintage. These were probably from the first batch that we did, so they're a little bit older. And then you can kind of warm it up. So you're actually getting that warmth of your body to warm up the hops. And of course, you're making a mess everywhere. And then smell it again. And what I'm actually getting is that less of that grassy, green hop aroma, and more of the subtle complexities. So this one really comes across as that peach kind of stone fruit notes. It almost smells like a juicy peach. There's a little bit of that like citrus lime zest kind of going on. And of course, you've still got those green aromas. This is a blend that we really recommend for a West Coast style IPA. So this is really just a classic quintessential, my favorite style of IPA. And I'd love to hear if you actually are on the chat, if you're doing this along with me, if there's any aromas that come across to you that are really strong. Oh, one of the things I do want to show is that this is kind of the data that I typically collect on a day-to-day basis, these spider charts. They provide a really good guide for what we're kind of looking for, but if you're looking for a specific style of hops, call up your representative and get them to talk you through it, because they've got a lot of words that they can use to describe these hops that are not just on our spider charts. So even though those are fun. Peach ring gummies, I love it. Slight bit of black pepper, grapefruit, yes, grapefruit for sure. These ones just make my mouth water. Like I kind of get that little like feeling of saliva in the back of my throat. So these ones are really fun. This one is Evergreen hops, Kylie. Tomato and carrot. Yeah, I honestly think that for me, when I first started smelling hops on a regular basis, I had a really hard time getting past those vegetal components and getting into the fruity aspects of that. And you homebrewers probably are the same. Until you kind of dump that into a pot of, a boiling wort, you probably are just like, wow, I hope this turns out well. And some of that we'll actually experience through the process of biotransformation. There is a lot that happens in both the kettle and in the fermentation tank that can actually take myrcene, for example. Myrcene is almost non-existent in the final beer, but what it is a precursor for all of these other aroma compounds that come down the line that can transform into these wonderful fruity floral aromas, especially under the influence of yeast. Before I move on to the next hop, because I know that a lot of you may not have this, Rana only gets the citrusy smell. Yep, that's totally fine. And if you have a little bit left of this when you're done, put it into some cold water, room temperature water, and do a little bit of stir and let it sit till it breaks up a little bit, and try it again and see if your experience of the hops actually changes by doing that cold water extraction. It's a really good way to get to know your hop varieties. In this case, the blends that we have are just these really amazing products that we've done through the RTC. We had the Rahr Technical Center, excuse me. We had some really awesome work that was done on designing these blends for a specific instance. This Evergreen, like I said, for example, was the West Coast style. And this Zamba blend was one of the ones we initially started with, which is a Northeast IPA style blend. So if you want to open that one up, tomato paste, citrus. First time with actual hops, smells like tomato paste. Yep, that's not surprising at all, for sure. Cheesy. Okay, so you interpret the vegetal as cheesy. I think that's a really important thing to bring up. There are definitely going to be times when you're experiencing that kind of cheesy aroma. That can indicate that your hops have either been heat abused or temperature mistreated. I hope that's not the case in this time. But definitely keep leaning into that. Try to get some different samples. I think these are only a couple dollars at your homebrew store. So go and find a couple of them and see what else. Oh, Haley went Zamba first. That's okay, Haley. We'll move on to that one now. So yes, the Zamba. And you can go back and forth and see like, what's the difference here? And again, your nose is going to burn out really fast. So just take a break if you need to. Zamba's way more fruity up front. Yeah, this one is definitely our juicy IPA. And I'm just looking at what they say on here. I know that I created the data, or I helped collect the data on these, but it was so long ago, I've forgotten a lot of what it is. And I have a cold, so I'm not actually smelling much today. Yeah, juicy tropical fruits, pineapple, mango, stone fruits, candy. That one's a lot one. So when someone said candy peach rings on the Evergreen, I actually get that, and I get I've forgotten the name of it, but those like red apple candies a lot in hops. Red apple, herbal, Fruit Loops, big head of mango. Yeah, mango's actually a really interesting one because it's highly, if you actually ever kind of think about mango, or find some fresh mango juice, it's a very sulfury kind of flavor, and a lot of those tropical fruits are. That actually typically will get a lot of crossover with that from hops because of the presence of this 3-MMP or 4-MMP, which are these compounds that are present in tomcat urine. So we'll get this catty kind of flavor or aroma, which in small doses smells really delicious and fruity and tropical. And in large doses, everybody's probably experienced that cat pee beer, which some people love. To me, I had a cat that peed in my house a long time ago, and so it's not my favorite thing, but small doses, yes. Getting the rind of a grapefruit, unripe mango, yep. And I'm kind of rubbing these together, and I'm actually getting more of that catty aroma now that I'm actually kind of grinding this together with my fingers. These ones are actually a lot more oily, and I don't have the COA in front of me, but oh yeah, lot higher myrcene content here. So these info sheets are available on the BSG website if you want to get a little bit more. I don't think those went out with the boxes, but all you have to do is just type in BSG Zamba or BSG Evergreen. Cat candy. Mango smells like cat urine. Yep, nope. Totally with you there. Yeah, I really love the Zamba. Honestly, Zamba is probably one of my favorite blends that we've released. Sativa is another one that's come out recently that's kind of fun. So,
oh, I haven't tried that one yet.
Oh, thank you for putting up those links. I appreciate it. All right. So, did we have any questions come through that is because we're kind of in that stage of the presentation.
We do have quite a few questions here.
Awesome.
I'm just going to go ahead and start with the ones with the most upvotes, and we can work our way down.
Okay.
First one here, psychologist here with a nerd question. Have you looked into researching common smells in positive social environments and using those as a basis for trying to make hop hybrids that awaken sensory memories, like the combination of fresh cut grass, early spring flowers, and moist dirt to create a hop that you use in spring brews to make it feel more springy?
Oh, that's an awesome idea. I think you should totally get on that. No, I haven't done any research on that. BSG is kind of unique in the sense that I work for Rahr Corporation, so technically I work for the overarching umbrella that owns Rahr Malting and BSG. But BSG contracts, we're not growers of hops, but we support research through university settings. We do a lot of work with the Hop Research Council to support their new line varieties. And just a couple of months ago, we did a hop rub with about 10 or 12 new potential varieties. So I think that's a great idea. I don't know how we would actually make that carry through into a beer. That's always the challenge, right? Like whatever you're smelling in the field or what you're smelling here right now is not necessarily what the final beer is going to taste like. But I love that idea. And I think it sounds like you're well on your way to developing your own kind of spring beer. I think there's enough like floral and fruity hops out there, maybe some earthy malt that you can get in there. I wish I could tell you more, but I think that's an awesome question.
That would be a great beer. I would be all about that.
Let us know when that's released.
Let's move on to another question. How's the sensory process been during the pandemic with lots of people losing their olfaction and taste? Do you think something will change on those experiences, or how do you think that'll develop?
I think for me, my initial thought was actually, how do we do sensory tests when we can't get closer than 6 feet to each other? And we have a lot of our sensory panelists who are now working from home. So for me, that's been the biggest impact. We actually have had to modify our program to make it so that rather than having everybody come together in one room and sit and talk about it, we have a remote setting. So people either come into the room as they need throughout the day and pour themselves their own beer, or they take it back to their desks. We haven't had to utilize Zoom for these yet, but I know that some companies are actually sending beer cans home with people and then getting on Zoom and kind of doing the roundtable evaluation that way.
Yeah, we did our entire hop selection via Zoom this year.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And I know that BSG and some other companies definitely are. I mean, can you imagine how much more plastic we're going through?
There was a lot on the table by the time we were done.
Yeah, for sure. So all these companies are having to modify the way that they're doing things. I think by this time we've kind of gotten some practice in on how they're doing it, but I think a lot of things have changed. You mentioned the lack of olfaction. We've been really fortunate in my group to not have any positive cases of COVID. We have a very small group. There's only 15 of us in our building. But I know that some people in our company have, obviously. And I do know that there's been some increased awareness of research on what's called anosmia. I mentioned it earlier. So the lack of being able to smell. Monell Research Center, based out of Pennsylvania, has always had kind of this anosmia research going on. And obviously with the prevalence of COVID, that's just had some really increased awareness. So I've seen a lot of news articles recently about how to kind of train yourself back to smelling, and we're just still in that really early stages, but definitely something that something that's been forefront of researchers' minds.
That's great. Another good question that came across is, what are simple, usable ways we can evaluate our hops in the brewery to ensure we will get the best usage of them?
Sure. Best usage of them. That's where I'm tripping up on it. I am not a brewer, so I will just preface that. But I think that starting by smelling your hops, just like we did here, opening the bag, smelling it, looking at it, make sure that they haven't been heat abused, make sure they're not brown, make sure they're not smelling like Parmesan cheese or onion soup. Those are all indications that your hops have been stored in a poor environment. I'm seeing some people here on the side. I think I got my hops heated. You'll know, especially if you make sure that you smell them. In terms of using them the best way, I think that at least on our info sheets here, we've got some suggestions for when to use them. The difference between an aroma hop and a kettle hop is pretty clear. Of course, the lines get blurred, right, as you start to look at different recipes. And Monica, I'm curious as to how your brewery kind of deals with that. Do you?
Well, Brendan, the owner and head brewer, Mosaic and Citrigo and everything, those are his favorite hops.
Yeah.
We're also very West Coast heavy, so that's not surprising. For us, really, it's a little trial. We've been even using incognito recently. One of the nice things is being able to do, a 20-barrel test batch. We're a production size brewery, so that's small for us.
Yeah.
And kind of playing with some new things and seeing what works best and whatnot.
Sure. Someone's asking what kettle hop is. That's typically a hop that has less emphasis on the aroma compounds and more on the alpha acids content, just to provide the bittering.
Yeah, and there's a couple questions here.
Sure.
Both kind of sit on the same thing. One is, I've always frozen my extra hops. Is there a risk to the hops in doing that? And then another question was, how important is temperature for storing hops?
Sure. Temperature is important. I would say a dark, cool environment. And these are obviously provided in a dark bag, but once you open them, you're exposing them to oxygen. So once you open them, either try to figure out how to suck that oxygen, flush it with nitrogen. There's a couple different ways you can store them if the bag's been open. Freezing actually gets, if you're going to use the whole thing once you open it, I don't think there's much risk to that. But what you can happen is if you store like a 11-pound bag, one of the big pound bags, and you take it out of the freezer, what can happen is moisture can actually condense on those hops, and then if you put them back or you keep them out for a while, you can actually get mold and mildew issues. So I would just be really careful about what you're going to be doing with it after you freeze it. Probably a cooler is the best way to go. We keep all of our hops at the tech center in our walk-in, which is the same temperature we store our beer at. But definitely take note of your crop year, your storage conditions, and if you have any issues with the age of those hops, don't put them in your beer, because once they're in your beer, you can't change it. Did I answer both those questions, Monica?
Yeah, I think you got that. Let's see here. I think we got through most of them. There's one here. I was thinking about a peaches and cream beer, like a milkshake IPA with Philly sour yeast, since so many people are identifying peach and or stone fruit in the Zamba and Evergreen hops. How can I best use them to bring out those flavors in this type of beer?
Oh, good question. Like I said, I'm not a brewer, so I wish I really, that's one of the goals that I have for myself, actually, is to learn more about how these applications are. I think that I can, I think I can safely say I don't know on that one, and I apologize. But I love the idea of that. I think that if you look, I think social media, BSG has been BSG Hops or BSG Craft has been promoting the use of these Zamba hops by some of our partner breweries. So definitely look into that more. And you can always call our customer service line. I'm sure they have plenty of resources that I don't have access to. So.
Claudine had a question on the sign here, incognito. I don't know if you know much about this. I'll try not to mess it up. Incognito is like a hop extract, so there's no vegetable matter whatsoever. It's a liquid that we're able to add in and kind of get some more of those great hop characteristics in our West Coast IPAs, which is our thing. So we use that a lot now. That's been fun.
What was the question? Sorry.
Oh, no, she asked what incognito was. So I was just trying to answer that.
I got it.
Yeah. What's the most exciting part of sensory science for you, Emily? That question came across.
Oh gosh, the most exciting part. I honestly, the most exciting part for me is to know that, like, I actually signed up for BSG emails so that when a new product that I've worked on gets released to the public, I get to see that notification. And for me, even though it doesn't say my name on it and it doesn't say, the data may look, the words may look slightly different than what I've done, I absolutely love contributing to the ingredients that BSG releases. For me, that little thrill is so exciting. I also really love getting to smell and taste things before the public does. It's kind of the little exclusive factor. I drink beer. I have to say I drink less beer now that I work for Rahr than I used to, because I've actually trained myself and trained our panel on shelf life studies. So we talk about beer aging a lot and how things change over time. And unfortunately, I've become really hypersensitive to those oxidation and off flavors that appear as beer ages. So I actually drink a lot less beer than I used to, just because I'm really sensitive to that. But smelling and tasting beers before they even get on the market is well, in our case, we're not a production brewery, so we only brew to highlight ingredients. But to get to taste those ingredients before they get on the market is my favorite thing. And sensory, I love describing things. I love tasting things and smelling things. And even my 5-year-old now is like, Mama, can I smell your beer? And she gets to smell, she gets to say, it smells like whatever. And sometimes she's totally on. So I love kind of passing that excitement and knowledge on. And I think any of you brewers know that getting to taste the results is always super fun.
That's great. Well, that takes us to the end of our time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Emily, thank you for presenting. I learned a lot. I hope everyone else did too. You guys will all be able to download this talk, so please do. I believe the PDF will be available for download as well afterwards, so you can review that. Again, go check out the scholarships and all those fun things on the website, and we'll see you guys at another seminar.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Monica. Y'all are awesome.
Bye,
Enjoy the
guys.
rest of the summit, y'all.